Welcome to the April Coffee Box, everyone. And for April, we have April Coffee Roasters and Patrick Rolfe. Can you introduce yourself a little bit and say what you're up to and a little bit about the roastery?
Definitely. So I'm Patrick Rolfe. I run a roastery in Copenhagen called April. We've been around for about 4.5 years now, roasting on smart roast lowering machine, 15 kilo. We have opened a little store here in Copenhagen as well. Originally, I'm from Sweden. Been roasting a bit all over the place. Spent quite a lot of time in Berlin. Do a bit of consultancy. I do a bit of competitions every once in a while as well, whenever you're allowed to. And yeah, super excited to be with KaffeBox here. We've been part of the discussion before, and it's really cool to kind of be back as well. Yeah.
Great. It's great to have you again. And okay, we can maybe hop right into the coffees and we can talk about the Costa Rican first.
Volcán Azul as a farm and Alejo as a farmer, if we should start talking with him, is like I've been working. It's fair to say I've been working with a few farmers over the years now. Like I've been in coffee for a while. We've been sourcing coffee for quite a few years, and especially going into April, I've been very kind of in tune with it, and it's unprecedented to see coffee that is aging as well as the coffee coming out of Volcán Azul. Like the way that he processes coffees are perfect, more or less. As in, he does it so well, um, which is one interesting thing. And then on top of that, with the being the H17, which is really just it's a mutation or a variation of an H1, which is another varietal that we also work with at the Volcán Azul farm. The cool thing with the farm is that he actually works with about 40 active varietals
Yeah.
that are all in production, which is also unprecedented. Like you don't do that unless you're a gigantic farm, basically, because financially it doesn't make sense because the lot sizes become so small.
Yeah.
It costs too much money, basically. But this is basically then a Villa Sarchi varietal, which is quite common in Central America, crossed with Sarchimor, basically, which is more or less a Robusta hybrid. So there's like 0.00 something percent of Robusta in that coffee,
A distant
which is
cousin.
really, yeah, exactly, which is really interesting because if you go to the Volcán farm, which we do at least once a year, granted, not unfortunately not this year, um, but if you go there and you look at the yields that are coming out of those trees, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
He gets a lot more cherries, which is important for him as a farmer. He gets a lot more reliable crop, which is important for him as a farmer. Central America is very challenged when it comes to different diseases,
Yeah.
especially leaf rust.
Hmm.
Um, and varietals like this, especially in the early stage of the varietal, is definitely be more resistant towards that than what other varietals will be. I should say that it becomes a bit more complicated when it comes to these varietals because just because something is resistant early on in its life,
Yeah.
over the years it can actually lose that resistance.
Yeah.
So it becomes really complicated. But on top of that, this coffee tastes really good.
Mm.
And I think that's the interesting part, right? Because you have a high yielding coffee that is easy to farm, small trees, high yields, that is resistant to most diseases, and it's delicious.
Hmm. It's
Um,
perfect.
it's kind of a
Perfect.
win-win. It's more or less a perfect coffee.
Mm.
And I mean, he has other fancier varietals at the farm for sure. Some of them cut better, definitely. But they're also every year the yield goes up and down. They're, diseases, not diseases. There's always challenges. Whereas these coffees are a lot more consistent. And also, like honestly, I was a bit surprised over the quality of that cup actually.
Mm.
And I think I told you that already, but it is basically KaffeBox exclusive, right? So we bought a tiny little lot of that coffee, and all of that coffee went to you more or less. So literally, the subscribers are the only ones in the world that are tasting it this season because it doesn't exist outside of that.
Mm. So drink with gratitude.
Something like that. It's Alejo as a farmer is it's just amazing, and especially also when it comes to the processing of these coffees. State of the art technology. Again, equipped to deal with very very small lot sizes. This coffee has been first depulped through a like the fanciest Pegasus machines you can have, which is basically the high end depulpers on the market.
Hmm.
Leave a tiny amount of the fruit still on. It's about 10%, which is
Yep.
almost nothing. Um, which is where the kind of yellow part comes in, and then just dried for about. It's a bit different, but I think this lot specifically was up at 12 days. And then, this is kind of the kicker when it comes to his processing, because what he does for most of the lots is that he actually finishes them off in mechanical dryers,
Yeah.
which is really interesting because
Hmm.
mechanical dryers is something that we kind of frown upon when it comes to coffee processing,
Hmm.
because it's something that the kind of commercial industry is active in. But what he does is that he puts them on really, really low temperatures, around 40 degrees Celsius. And then
Hmm.
he just leaves it there for the basically the last night of processing,
Hmm.
or last 12 hours.
Yep.
And I think that that's part of why we're getting such a good coffee actually this far off from harvest.
Hmm.
Because if I cut that coffee, I wouldn't display any notes of aging in it whatsoever.
Yeah.
And that's quite remarkable. There's very few copies you can say the same about of any kind of caliber.
He must be able to get a
So
lot more uniform drying and get it to exactly the stage he wants with the last
with the
little bit
mechanical
of
drives,
mechanical.
exactly right. Especially because these lots are so small. He can basically have full control when it comes to that kind of last part of mechanical drying as well.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what it comes down to. Because if we go a bit geeky and we look at moisture content and water activity throughout his lots, different lots, they're
Hmm.
so consistent.
Yeah.
It's unheard of. And I'm pretty sure it is, as you mentioned, that it comes out of the fact that drying, that kind of last stage of drying, after again, like he's giving it plenty of time. Now, this
Hmm.
lots is first dried on the patio. He also had raised beds, but
Hmm.
it's funny with farmers because a lot of farmers tend to prefer patios over rice beds. It feels like it's more a roaster thing to prefer raised beds over patios.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that's when it gets the kind of uniformity, and the H1 almost, not a critique to Arsosala, but it almost tastes more Ethiopian than what Arsosala does.
Mm.
At this point, right? If you move over to the Arsosala, it's also a really interesting coffee, being that it's actually the majority of the coffee is one varietal.
Hmm.
So it's basically a process station that have genetically traced and identify two kind of main varietals, which would be Typica and Bourbon, and then been able to kind of separate lots of varietals, um, which is a big thing for us here at April, because this season actually all of our Ethiopian coffees have been single varietals. Actually, we
Hmm.
haven't had any mixed heirlooms, and
Yeah.
that's just part of getting a bit more traceability, getting a bit more definition in the cup. It becomes Arsosala in this case becomes a very kind of candid citrus, slightly jasmine, not as wild, as very kind of refined, the cup. So it's not the most complex Ethiopian, but it gets still a really kind of defined, clean cup, which I appreciate. You
Hmm.
definitely have a bit more age character in the Arsosala now, for example. But it's also this kind of time of the year where a lot of the Kenyan coffees are showing a tiny bit of age in them. Um,
Hmm.
which makes a bit of a difference. And then the Arsosala Cooperative, which is kind of interesting. I should say that both of these coffees we're buying again this season.
Hmm.
So Arsosala has become our kind of house Ethiopian coffee now, more or less. And then Volcán Azul we purchased from the very first season here in April, and has been kind of very much a big part of what we do in terms of green coffee here, right? but then Arsosala for sure. And it's tasting even better this season as well.
Do you have a or how do you brew them? A suggested brew recipe for people?
Yep. So we are using the April Brewer, which is the brewer that we kind of designed to exactly to brew our coffees with. And I think that's obviously I'm going to say that's the preferred brewer because we did design it to especially deal with slightly lighter, a bit more modern roasted coffees. For those of you that don't have it, I'm just going to give you some kind of basic tips. We also have a YouTube channel with a bunch of brewing recipes, so it could be worth looking at.
I can link that too.
Yeah. Advice number one would definitely be give these coffees a bit of time. So we're looking at least 2.5 to 3 weeks after roasting. I tend to drink the coffee I'm drinking now is actually a bit older than that, up at 4 months or 4 weeks. Sorry. So I tend to always prefer resting the coffees a bit longer. That's just going to suit better with a lighter roasted coffees.
Yeah.
You make sure that all of that CO2 is kind of left in. I always prefer doing small brews over large brews. Small brews being between 200 to 300 mils. It's very rare that I do a pour over that is larger. And it comes down to the coffee bed, basically. So when it comes to coffee brewing, you want to saturate the coffee as evenly as possible. And it goes without saying that the less coffee you have, the easier that is.
Yeah.
On top of that, when it comes to brewing, which is something I would really recommend, is to consider stepping away from the blooming part. So the idea of blooming coffee with manual brews is something we left behind a long time ago, mainly because blooming is just a visual representation of CO2 leaving the coffee. So if your coffee is roasted quite light and rested properly, you're going to have no CO2 left. So it really doesn't have a function for the taste. So what we like to do is to basically break up the pouring into two parts. So I recommend using 13 grams of coffee for the Ethiopian Arsosala and 12 grams of coffee for the Costa Rican H17. And what I would do 2 pours identical. I would pour 100 grams of water, where 40 grams of those are in a circle and 60 grams is in a center. And I would pour all of that water within 10 seconds. So it's basically 10 grams per second. If you want to have a ratio. And then I would wait for 35 seconds and I would do the second pour.
Yeah, so pretty quick.
I'm basically done. Pretty quick. I'm looking at a total brew time of, I'm going to give you guys a kind of a wide window here, but it should be tasting good regardless, between 2:30 up to 3 minutes. And that should give you, if you're a bit geeky, it should give you a TDS of somewhere along the lines of 1.26 up to 1.3, which is what we're aiming for. That's definitely a weaker cup than what some people enjoy. So if you want a stronger cup, recommend doing the same thing, but then just push the grind size a tiny bit fine. Yeah.
Cool, that's interesting. I haven't tried that, so I'll certainly try that brew recipe.
Yeah, it's how we actually brew with the April Brewer in the store.
Yeah.
At the moment, and it's super consistent. It's delicious, which is the most important part, and it's also very easy to replicate. So it's about being able to make multiple tasty cups of coffee. So highly recommended.
How would you explain the change in flavor from if I were to drink this the day after it was roasted and 4 weeks after it was roasted? How does the flavor develop?
Very good question. I think it's important to state that it's not that it doesn't taste good initially. It's just that it tastes much better afterwards. And the main thing for that is just the CO2. And especially like one of the trickier things when it comes to CO2, because CO2 you build up when you roast, right?
Yeah.
And actually, the lighter the coffee, the longer the degassing process takes, which sounds a bit strange because you should technically have less CO2. It's just that it actually forces the CO2 to leave the coffee slower. So what you're tasting in those initial days, especially within the first week, is this very, very kind of almost chewy mouthfeel that just isn't as clean as you want your coffees to be. So it's less flavor clarity. The mouthfeel is a bit drier, basically. It's a bit sandy. Especially you see this in espresso, for example, where a good kind of indication or historically have been if you brew a coffee day after roast, your crema is going to be massive, right?
Yeah.
And then if you do it 4 weeks later, it's going to be really thin. And I mean, we would always go really thin because crema is one part of pressure, but also part of just the amount of CO2 you have in the coffee. So cleaner, more defined flavors comes with time. Also, consistency comes with time as well. So one little trick I should probably mention that I haven't mentioned is that in the store here, and also personally, when I brew, like the coffee I'm drinking now, um, which is actually the 817, was grinded 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So what we do in the store is that we actually pre-ground all of the coffee minimum the evening before service. So we pre-ground it, we dose it in containers with the amount of coffee that we need. And then that's what we do. So during service, we don't do any grinding. And the reason for that is that just kind of like Alejo, when he does his drying in the end, the kind of short mechanical drying, is that just that last kind of pre-grind, make sure that all of that CO2 just leaves the coffee.
Yeah.
And then it'll be a lot more consistent. It will be a lot tastier, especially when you brew with, when you make espresso, for example. You're going to have way better consistency over a bag of coffee, let's say 250 grams, if you just grind all of that through directly. Versus if you're actually dosing it and grinding it throughout the day or throughout the week or throughout the month. So pre-grinding, for sure, always pre-grind your coffee, which is a bit controversial, but
Yeah.
and you have to do it and dose it directly, right? So
Mm.
I'm not saying do it in a full bag and then open and close the bag all the time and redose,
Yeah.
but do it once, dose it, done, and then you can leave that for up to 3 days. And it's going to be delicious, if not better, from the fresh.
Yeah, well, I'll certainly test that out. I've been in the camp of grind seconds before you brew. So
Yeah, sure. I mean, which a lot of people are, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing in any way. I'm just saying that it's actually preferred in terms of my taste to do it before.
Yeah, well, I'll certainly do it. We'll have to do some blind tests here and see
Yeah,
which one we
for sure.
prefer. We may be surprised.
Definitely. Yeah.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
We do have a few things coming up, which is one, April Brewer in glass
Yeah.
coming. Two, April server. And three, basically our own kind of tapper distribution setup. Like one of the things I've been very focused on now this season is to, I think when you open up a coffee store or shop or whatever you want to call it, you realize very quickly that you start kind of thinking about the equipment you're using. And you want to make sure that you know everything about the equipment and that it has the same kind of quality and story that our green coffee has that we roast, right? So I'm kind of on a mission to produce everything in terms of brewing equipment that we're using ourselves, so that we know exactly where it comes from and exactly how it's been produced. So that's the latest kind of thing that we're doing at the moment.
Cool. That'll be fun to see. And speaking of April Brewers, we'll have a little giveaway on this YouTube video. If you want to win an April Brewer, see in there, you can post your favorite brew recipe in the comments on the video, and then we'll be picking 5 winners from the video to send away a April Brewer.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thanks for your time.
Super.
And
yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
See you again.
Definitely. Talk soon.
Right.
Ciao.